and welcome to The Front Page. I'm Racing Post editor Tom Kerr and I'm your host today. The Front Page has taken a short break the last few weeks, but a lot has happened over that period. Britain has a new Prime Minister, a new monarch, and racing has sadly lost its greatest friend and ally, Queen Elizabeth. There's plenty been happening within the sport as well. We've got an autumn target for Bide. Willie Mullins has reunited with his old ally, Michael O'Leary. And British racing's leaders got together at a two-day summit to discuss how to save the sport. I'm joined by Chris Cook and John Harding. Welcome, guys. Thanks for joining. And we're going to go straight in with the first story, which is mine, and it's about the 48-hour summit, although I guess they weren't actually meeting for all 48 of those hours. A two-day summit in central London where 18 of British racing's top leaders from across the BHA racecourse and thoroughbred sectors came together to try to work out a way forward for British racing, which of course has been bedeviled in recent months by a host of problems, including low field sizes, dwindling crowds, an exodus of talent abroad, and of course perennial issue of prize money. I think it's fair to say that anyone who was hoping that this summit would produce a oven-ready plan for British racing was going to be disappointed, because it's pretty hard to get British racing's leaders to agree on what colour grass is, never mind on the substance of a plan for racing. But nonetheless, I think you've got to be fair, or I'm going to be fair, and say there was some fairly positive outcomes insofar as you could have expected. Basically, the summit attendees were able to agree on a statement which basically said that they were absolutely unanimous on the need for serious and radical changes to make long-term improvements to British racing. Of course, there was very little detail about what might actually change, but the scope of what would be looked at was at least fairly wide-ranging. They talked about the organisation of the racing programme, they talked about the presentation of the sport's most high-profile events, and they talked about the sort of marketing of the sport, all of which sort of lays the stage for talks over the next 6 months, which clearly is being signposted that they're going to be looking at some fundamental building blocks of the sport. Things like how the racing programme is structured, what the top races are, how the top races look and feel, how they fit together, what racing we have on TV, what racing we have on weekends, and so on and so forth. The devil, of course, is in the detail, and as we know, in the past, while British racing's leaders are periodically capable of agreeing on the need for change, they have very different ideas about what ought to change, and that is where things fall down. Chris, I could see by your fantastic facial expressions during that preamble that you perhaps were not as impressed by this outcome as I was.
Really disheartened, and maybe it's my own fault for expecting too much, but it just feels like here we are again, having to, defer our expectations until the next stage of the process, which is sort of where we were earlier this year when, you remember, they sort of torpedoed that plan to call, was it 300 fixtures?
Yeah. Races, not fixtures.
Races, yes, fixtures would have been a serious move. And I guess I'm prepared again to kind of go along with it, but there's basically no detail in here. And you sort of think, well, I mean, so many crossovers have died, over the course of these 2 days, and for what? I just wish they could talk to us like adults. The press releases that came out of this were just full of tech talk and wonk speak, and why can't they tell us, well, look, it's really difficult, we're starting from a low base here, we're having to come up with a strategy for an enormous industry, step by step. Obviously this should have been in place years before now, but we are where we are. It's going to take time, please bear with us. If they approached us with that level of frankness, then I would have more patience. But they're giving us bluster and expecting us to be happy about it. And frankly, I'm disheartened. Things need to change, and it's already hard to see how they can produce meaningful change for next year. And when they start using phrases like, this is always the giveaway for me, a package of measures, or the only thing that's more infuriating to me than a package of measures is a suite of measures. I think a package of measures is where you have 2 or 3 ideas, and a suite is maybe if you have to have 4 or 5 ideas, or more than that. But basically what it boils down to is we have more than one idea, maybe, but we won't tell you what they are. It's just, I think it's a way of distracting you from the fact that they don't really know what they're going to do, and they haven't agreed on it, even if they could come up with any good ideas.
I think that's very obvious. They don't know what they're going to do, and I'm already dreading the siren call of the consultants coming in at vast expense to tell them what to do. There was indeed one representative of Deloitte at the meeting, I know. So we'll see what happens. I think you're absolutely right to be cynical about the lack of proposals. But of course, part of the problem, John, is that the structure of British racing is such that it is exceedingly difficult to move ahead. One of the things we're expecting over the next few weeks is governance changes. Is that going to make it easier for the sport to put in place a plan that actually delivers meaningful change as promised?
Well, you certainly hope so, and it's almost the fact that they weren't able to agree on anything very quickly was a fairly good advert for the review in general. They almost justified them being there by producing this kind of business speak bingo press release. And look, it's about where you set the bar, isn't it? And certainly with structural change, I think it has to happen. But it's, again, we're waiting for that next phase. It's very good at saying, kind of, these are the issues, and the structure is creating a logjam, which I believe is a given. Everyone recognises that, but again, it's that very big step from recognising the issue to fixing the issue. And I understand the impatience, because we're pointing out problems that have been there for months, and you wonder why it takes a 48-hour summit to do it. But again, it's where are our expectations? If you're down really low and you think, well, actually just them being in the same room is an achievement in itself, which it is, almost a minor miracle that they've agreed on something, then okay, it's a success. But there's a long way to go, and I just think it's okay to, like you say, it's okay to recognise that there's a big problem ahead of us, but I think the starting point has to be, we almost need to start at the end and say, well, what's the long-term strategy? And then we look at measures to meet that end. Just chucking a load of measures out there with no real joined up, measurable. But look, this might be thrashed out, and I'm willing, like you, to go along with it. But structural change has to be very high on that agenda, I think.
And so we do expect that to happen. So just to fill in those who haven't been following this fascinating story closely, basically, we currently have a system in British racing where you kind of have governance by veto. Anyone can block something they don't like, and it sounds like what's going to happen, something that's going to go before the BHA board next month, apparently has been agreed by the key parts of the sport, would basically give more power to the BHA board, which would become the ultimate decision-making body in the sport. So that would clearly be positive, because it does remove the risk of veto. But the fact that we had to get 18 people in a room to agree a set of principles which, let us be honest, were not challenging at all. And indeed, one moment I found quite funny over the 2-day thing is that on the first day we tried to get them to tell us who was at the meeting, and they couldn't agree to release the identities of the 18, although they did subsequently the following day overcome that important point. Yeah, it is alarming. The sport has not got a good track record of putting self-interest to one side, and I think we have to assume that even if the governance changes make the sport easier to run, you are still going to find it very difficult to get, say for example, a racecourse group to do something which is against their self-interest.
Yeah, definitely. And another disconcerting aspect to this, it maybe just shows how much time the sport has lost, is it's like we're refighting battles from the 90s again. I mean, all this stuff about how we need to have sort of greater centralised control over fixtures, that derives from the OFT intervention, which I don't, how many decades ago that was. Peter Saville was talking about how underexploited Sundays are. We should be doing more racing on Sundays. I mean, that conversation's been going on for about a quarter of a century. Yeah. Just the impression that you're left with is there's a whole stack of problems that we should have addressed ages and ages ago. I mean, several iterations of our regulatory body ago. Yeah. And we're now having to sort of deal with the fallout of not having done any of that. It's like we're having to tackle maybe 20 years worth of good governance in one go. So I guess, of course, that's going to be difficult. But they need to get on with it because, as Jonathan says, if we accept the fact that they're in the same room as a victory, then progress is going to go at a snail's pace.
So what should change? They've said they're going to come back by the spring with a comprehensive suite or package of proposals. I can't remember which it was, because that's basically the deadline in order to make changes for 2024. So, I mean, it's already quite depressing that we're going to be waiting quite so long before seeing meaningful changes. But what do we want to see by next spring?
I would like to see a fixture list, or really a race program list that is linked directly to the available horses. I mean, I'm sort of with Peter Saville in as much as I don't necessarily want to see fewer fixtures. I think maybe cutting back on your product, you'd have to see that as a sort of regressive step. Maybe it is going to be necessary, a bit of pruning in order to help grow the whole. But I can't help thinking, if you could come up with the right races, and if you could link it more closely to the available horses in a way that doesn't happen just now, then we can have success in improving field sizes and therefore betting interest and spectator interest.
Yeah. John, what would you like to see?
I mean, in a broader sense, what I would like to see is not simply measures being introduced to put out fires in isolation. I would love there to be an accessible, transparent, I'm trying to avoid business speak, but some sort of just a long-term strategy with simple, this is what we want British racing to look like in 5 years, this is what we want to look like in 10 years. Simple measures towards that. I don't want piecemeal, okay, well, the fixture list would be high on the agenda, that's not so much, but little tweaks, and because we're long past tweaking, and to borrow a phrase you used to use quite, rearranging the deck chairs. We're past that at this point.
Do you not think we need some KPIs as well?
We do need some KPIs, yeah. But it's an important point. It needs to be measurable.
I mean, I'm being serious, really.
No mention of prize money either. I mean, you've got to look at the way that the sport is funded again. Surely, well, I think it is a case of going back to the drawing board and saying, we've got all the right people in the room. Let's think about what we want to do long term and have it sort of mapped out like that before you start looking at the specifics. Because I don't think anyone really agrees on what they want British racing to look like.
Well, this is the problem, and the point about prize money is a fair one, and a few people picked up on it. It was an odd omission from that press release, so they didn't mention it. But I think the concept that's underpinning this strategy work is sound. Is that you can't just look at prize money and say we're going to increase prize money. You actually need to increase the popularity of the sport. You need to work within the funding model we have, which basically is the more people bet on and follow racing, the more money the sport has. And therefore you need to work on the basis, well, if we make the sport more popular, more appealing as a betting product and a sporting product, then you're hopefully going to, well, you will directly see the benefits through funding. But let's just talk quickly about some of the things that's been signposted as likely to change. They've talked about segmenting the product. Now that is a business phase right there, isn't it? But basically what that means in normal language is I think a concept that you take the top action, the stuff which is most obviously elite sport, and you make that distinct in appearance, in presentation, in naming from the rest of the product. But the idea of Premier Racing, Peter Saville's fingerprint all over that part. Does that actually make a difference? If we say to the sort of average TV viewer who's maybe a little bit interested in racing, maybe watches Royal Ascot and Cheltenham and the Derby, a Grand National, if we say this day, the King George Day at Ascot is also part of the same tier of racing, do they suddenly tune in?
Part of the British Champion Series, one might almost say.
Indeed.
Well, that sounds like a presentation issue. I mean, I presume that doesn't come with any sort of suggestions about fundamental change of how racing is organised. I mean, I could see some merit in it. I mean, if you could, particularly if you're talking about flat racing, you could join up all the sort of Group 1 races, across Europe and say, well, this is how these races interlink, and people would start to see some of the timing difficulties, like having the Mill Reef a week before the Middle Park, say, and then we could address stuff like that. I don't know. It might be helpful to people who are just new to the game to have their hand held while they get to know the pattern and how it operates. I can see some merit in that. I wouldn't necessarily like to see that sector of the sport actually being carved out and lifted away from the rest in a way that would leave the people who don't operate at that level, relatively ignored and stranded and underfunded.
Well, it is a valid question, isn't it, on whether it needs to be governed differently, whether it needs to be funded and structured differently, because there's very little in common between Goodwood and an all-weather track, for instance, in terms of where they derive their income and what type of racing they're trying to put on. And similarly, there are larger trainers who perhaps don't relate to the struggles at the bottom end, and it's whether you almost... Sure. But then you're creating a top division and a bottom division, aren't you? And that's the issue. And
I mean, at the moment, you can at least hope that horses and people will move between the various divisions, and what you're creating is a kind of community. I mean, particularly jockeys, who may exist for a long time at a certain level, and can hope to be sort of recognised and get better opportunities in the future. I quite like the idea of racing being seen as a whole, and the jockeys that you're seeing on one day at Southall, are sort of progressing towards Newmarket at the weekend. I enjoy seeing horses who are at low-key meetings who might have a future elsewhere. I instinctively want to resist this idea that we should be stratifying the sport and putting in any kind of obstacle to progress or even, I suppose, the other thing, decline.
I think I agree with you. You certainly wouldn't want to place any meaningful barriers between different parts of the sport. I do have some sympathy sometimes for the concept that if you make the elite of the sport more readily identifiable, that does make it a little bit easier for sort of casual fans and punters to engage with it. But it's clearly not going to move the dial massively. Similarly, another thing which has been clearly signposted is more money spent on marketing. This is based on the not unfair point that the Great British Racing marketing budget is in the low seven figures, which could compare very unfavourably with other sports. But I don't think anyone's sitting here thinking, well, if we double that, British racing is on the path to prosperity.
There's obviously more that can be done there, and I'm sure that increasing the budget, so that we're at least in the same ballpark as some other sports would be a very good idea. Let's try and get some people to pay attention to us who maybe don't even know we exist.
Yeah, and look at the huge success that women's football has had. Obviously, it's had some very major public events which have given it momentum, but clearly there's also been a lot of imagination and energy poured into getting people to come to the Women's Premier League, for example, which has had record crowds. So it does show that marketing can have a positive impact, but would racing have the money to really do something massive? Question mark over that. One last thing I want to mention is the idea, this is again Peter Saville's idea, that Sunday is an unexploited area, and that if you create more good quality racing and you get more racing on TV, then you get more money into the sport. Make sense?
Logically follows, yeah. Terrestrial TV is a bit of a boon, and racing's, I think, we've said it before, but racing is very lucky to have the backing that ITV gives it with these extra days and with the Sunday series and things like that. I mean, Sunday racing is always going to be contentious because from a sort of business perspective, yes, it makes sense. There's a lot of people who are sitting around twiddling their thumbs, wondering what to do after they've had their roast or something in the afternoon. Well, I am. And but then there's a knock-on effect then for the logistics of it, isn't there, for the staff, and you need an additional day off in the week, and whether that's feasible, and is it fair to...
It has to be feasible. You can't just keep on making stable staff turn out day after day. I think you probably also have to be clear that more Sunday racing is a TV product and a betting product, because every time I've ever spoken to a racecourse about this, they just don't want to race on Sundays if they can avoid it, if they can race on a Friday or Saturday instead.
The crowds are not that good, but that also has a knock-on impact, because one of the things which I think undermines any concept of sort of Premier Racing, and we'll come on to this later when we talk about the Racing League, is low crowds. Because the TV consumers are not daft. They can, you're sitting there telling them that this is really important, high quality racing, but they can see two man and a dog rattling about behind them. Well, there's something incongruous going on there.
Yeah, definitely. But I mean, it just seems to be like a cultural thing. I mean, Sunday racing has been with us a long time, but we've never ever got to the stage where People just expect to be going racing on a Sunday in Britain. And I don't quite know why that is. You know, Ireland, France, they have their biggest days on a Sunday. But racecourses just don't seem to like the idea here, because I guess you don't get drinkers and you don't get the corporate crowd. You know, they'd much rather turn out on Friday or Saturday or even a Thursday and put loads of money behind the bar. So they've obviously had a good long go at changing that culture, and we haven't got there yet.
It always comes back to booze, doesn't it?
Why not, indeed?
On that important note, we'll wrap up this one. Listen, we could talk all day about what should change in racing, what's happening behind the scenes through the strategy work. It is a huge story. It is going to rumble on. We hope to see some meaningful news coming out, and for the sake of everyone in racing whose livelihoods and rely on the sport, and for all those who have a passion for sport, they need to get this right. So, no pressure, guys. Second story today, and Chris, we're coming to you for an exclusive you broke this week.
Yeah, it wasn't exclusive, wasn't it? Jim Best has got his name back on a training licence, and this sort of feels to me like the end of a real saga, because you'll remember you were there for the disciplinary hearings in 2016 involving Jim, when the BHA brought a case against him. They said, you know, you told your conditional jockey to deliberately lose 2 races. And there was a hearing in April which banned him for 4 years, and then that was quashed because it turned out the person they got to chair the hearing had been paid for private work as a solicitor for the BHA. So they had to do the whole thing again later that year, and there was another hearing, I think, that year involving a different trainer in Ireland that had to be reheard as well. It was a really difficult time for the BHA, and a really contentious hearing. You know, Jim Best still maintains that, you know, he was completely innocent. But what was interesting to me was that having finally persuaded the BHA to give him a joint licence with his wife Susie, who's held the licence at their yard in Lewis for a few years, he was very clear that what he wants in the future is a much better relationship with the regulator. And I mean, I don't honestly think the BHA could have asked for more from him in the way of saying the right things, because, you know, in the past he sounded you know, quite bitter about the whole experience. He feels that they were out to get him, and I think if you look at the surrounding circumstances, you can quite understand why he felt that way. The panel's verdict back in 2016 was that his licence should be suspended for 6 months, and here we are 6 years later, you know, well, nearly 6 years later, he's finally got his name back on a licence. There are some good conditions attached. The most interesting one says that him and Susie have to have quarterly meetings with the BHA to review various aspects of their operation, including placement of their horses. I've asked the BHA and they haven't come back with a substantive answer, but I mean, I've never heard of a condition like that being applied to anyone's licence. So they're still operating under quite onerous conditions. But evidently he's just pleased to be back in the game, as it were. And he spoke, you know, with some pride about, you know, his 200 winners and the fact that AP McCoy used to ride winners for him. And he's been looking at the videos of the old days, you know, so he's really, you know, anxious to get back to training some horses and hopefully not being at constant loggerheads with the ruling body. He will remain, you know, a very contentious figure for some people. I mean, I thought there were real problems with the case that was brought against him, but evidently, you know, other people, they look at him with suspicion. Perhaps understandably in view of the fact that his name was hardly out the headlines for a whole year. Yeah,
I think you know, it is important to remember that as a result of the debacle with the initial case, the BHA brought in the disciplinary panel as it is now. It's much more independent. It is sort of helmed by some pretty you know, well qualified, legally trained individuals. You know, that was a positive, and also it was then that panel which ultimately banned Jim Best for 6 months.
Just not so much talking about Jim Best's case, but I do see a significant improvement in the reasons that are published by these panels. Some of the cases still take a hell of a long time to get through. But you know, it does feel in a lot of cases like what you're getting is a really substantially thought through decision.
There's a rigor to it now, which I think, you know, is probably very rare in sport, and sets racing apart. And that's definitely something which I think has to be, you know, the BHA have to be given credit for putting that in place, because racing of all sports needs this sort of level of quasi-judicial disciplinary function more than most because of the nature of the sport as a betting medium. Of course, one of the things what we've seen here though is that the disciplinary panel operates. They gave a 6-month ban, but then of course it's been 6 years for Jim Best, where the licensing panel, I presume in that period he has applied for a license, and the licensing panel have turned it down. Do we know why? Do we have the reasons for that ever been published?
There's been a sort of, there were some reasons for a decision a few years ago. There's been a sort of constant back and forth between the Bests and the BHA and the licensing committee. About a year ago he was asking to get his name on a joint license then, I know, and was sort of held off. I think the position was from the BHA's perspective, well, your yard is licensed, Susie Best was licensed under these conditions, and we want to proceed with it on that basis. So I suppose from the BHA's perspective, they've taken a sort of softly approach. I should say, you know, this people get very suspicious, but this wasn't one of those cases where, you know, X has lost the license, therefore his spouse immediately gets the license and carries on as before. I mean, they made Susie Best wait 9 months before she got her license. So it was like his penalty was already over by the time that they could have any runners from the yard. And initially 10 conditions attached to the license that sort of were reduced over time. I suppose the BHA has basically wanted to be satisfied and has been satisfied that the yard hasn't given rise to any further controversy. Which I suppose, you know, if you were an outsider, you would say, well, that's the prudent, you know, way to behave. But I don't see this same approach being taken in relation to too many other training operations. I think it's fair to say that this particular yard has been subjected to a great deal of scrutiny. You know, more than we see being applied elsewhere.
Do you think they've been treated unfairly?
Unfairly? Yeah, I would say unfairly in the sense of it's not the usual behaviour. It's not the standard BHA treatment. And if the BHA is going to justify that kind of behaviour, they need to come out and say, well, here's the evidence on which we're basing our attitude towards these people. I think they've been given an extremely hard time, much more than really anybody else that I've come across in the last few years.
What do you think, John? Is he, you know, subject to completely unprecedented restrictions and treated unfairly, or is he a convicted cheater who's lucky to get a second chance?
Well, it's incredibly difficult, isn't it? Because if the BHA go, yep, you serve your time, completely clean slate, there's going to be a great deal of scepticism. And it's almost, I mean, one might almost view it as a protection of the training operation that these things are in place, because in a way people will go, well, you know, he did this before, and they can point to the fact, well, actually, no, we're checking in, it's a gradual, he's almost on probation in a little bit with the public as much as he is the BHA, I suppose, in a sense of kind of earning back that trust. But it's difficult to say after 6 years that, okay, this has happened in the past, 6 years later we're still going to have that looming over you. There has to come a point where you're allowed to not move on, because there has to be necessary checks and balances, but move on enough. And it does feel fairly strict, certainly the checking in with the placement of horses.
Although we know how these things work, isn't it? It's a bit like, you know, the stewards asking for an explanation of improvement, where you say, well, you know, I thought he'd appreciate, you know, running the opposite way and over a distance after last.
It's an interesting situation for them to be in. Interesting, I'm using as a euphemism there, because I don't suppose they really know what to expect from the fact that they're going to have to discuss placement of their horses with officials at regular intervals. I mean, you know, does it mean that their license is imperiled if they have a handicap winner that was well backed? You know, the sort of thing that, you know, almost any trainer would expect to be able to do from time to time. Are they going to have to put cheek pieces on everything the first time it runs in a handicap in case it wins, so they got something to point to? You know, it wasn't just a case of duck egg, bang. You know, it can be interesting going forward, and clearly they're not out of the woods yet, but they've certainly been made to wait.
Certainly have. I guess you know, this is one of the interesting things about the licensing situation in British racing, where you have the disciplinary panel, which will give a punishment. The licensing panel can then basically keep people out of the sport indefinitely. You know, it will be fascinating. I don't know if it's happened, maybe it has. Mahmoud Al-Zaruni, of course, seeking to make his return to racing in the UAE. if he came over and applied for a training license, I think it's 1 to 100. The licensing committee says, try again next year, Mr. Alzuni.
The whole fit and proper person test, you would think, would be raised at that point. But the BHA, I remember they did used to brief in the cases where somebody had got a penalty that the reporters were sort of going, well, that's a bit light. And they'd say, well, sure, but then you've got to remember that once the ban's over, we still have discretion whether or not to give them a license, kind of thing. You don't hear that so much from them anymore, but it always struck me as being a kind of slightly underhanded way of meting out what you saw as justice.
Yeah.
You know, a slightly covert, hidden and suboptimal way of doing the job. You know, if you have reason to think badly of somebody, you should get it out into the open air and where they can test it, you know.
Just perhaps the one flaw in the disciplinary panel you know, sort of overhaul that they brought in 6 years ago is that while it is very transparent, while it is clearly operating to higher standards of rigour and professionalism than many other sporting disciplinary functions, there's still parts of how the sport is run and how it's policed which operate very much in the shadows and that we and even the participants in the sport see very little of.
Yeah, and I think you could say that trainers do worry about that, because we recently had the Mark Gillard case, didn't we? Where he was punished for not doing exactly what the racecourse vet told him to do on the day the horse had the injury. He felt that he behaved in a perfectly responsible way. His evidence to the hearing a couple of weeks back was that a vet that he uses told him, of the BHA, look, these people, you know, you've just got to appease them somehow, Mark. You just do what they say, because they, you know, they're taking no prisoners here. You know, they're going to do you in. I think among some trainers, you know, there is that feeling that the regulator's just out to get you, you know, is sort of behaving occasionally in a sort of bullying way. Now, you know, we're only talking about 2 cases here, so BHA on line 1 saying, "How dare you say these things?" But I think that's the thing. That is the way that they are seen, and I think you know, greater openness and transparency in their dealings, particularly from the licensing committee, would be beneficial in terms of their relationship with the racing professionals.
Lovely, thanks very much, Chris. We'll move on to our third and final story, and John, it's over to you. What are we talking about this week?
Mine's a 2-parter. So we have the conclusion of the 2nd edition of the Racing League, and I think it would be fair to say we'll get into it, but the jury's out on how successful that has been. My own view would be that while it's an improvement on the sort of corporate vehicles that we had before, Team Swish and Co. and what have you with regional things, there's a long way to go, certainly in terms of attendances, which you touched upon, and you know, we haven't got chanting and half scarves. I'm not sure people quite associate with the teams in the way they'd hoped. I'm not sure it's quite the sort of premium offering. There's been a lot of drumming up of interest from those on the payroll and pointing to, well, the prize money's good and it's innovative, so we're getting on with it. Well, why are you a doubter? It's not immune from criticism for those 2 facts. So we had the conclusion of that, which was tied in with another big story that's been rumbling on with jockeys getting involved with this, was Sean Levey. He was stood down at Sandown on the 14th after returning a positive sample from a sort of swab test for amphetamine, which was proved to be a false positive, important to say, but he faced a lengthy time off the track, 7-8 days including that day, and potentially winning the bonus of the Racing League with an extra kick in the teeth before a negative urine test, which he had to request, interestingly, and we'll get onto that when we talk about whether these processes need to be looked at. So yeah, ultimately a very unsatisfactory end to the Racing League, slightly overshadowed by this major incident, and we've now got jockeys and PJ McDonald and Dougie Costello talking about, well, we need to look at this procedure, quite why he couldn't have done a 2nd test if there was a fear of a false positive. Are they too quick to put the ban in place? There's a lot of debates, and there's certainly, I'd imagine, a review now about that process for testing prohibited substances as well. So a very interesting saga, and one I can see kind of rumbling on as well, and speaks to potential disconnect perhaps between the jockeys and the BHA at the moment on these things, because they've pointed out that it's a quick test, but we're not entirely happy for it. It's not comfortable. It's throwing up false positives more frequently than we'd like, obviously. and causing, in the instance of Sean Levey, unwarranted reputational damage. So, yeah, there's a lot to go at there.
I think I'm slightly taken aback. I was surprised by the strength of reaction from other members of the weighing room in the aftermath of this. And it actually sort of immediately reminded me of Paul Hannigan's column of a couple of weeks ago, where he sort of talked about the interference rules and how they have to change, but also he talked about the sort of culture in the weighing room right now. It almost sort of feels like there's a great deal of unhappiness in the weighing room on a number of matters right now. Are you getting that impression as well, Chris?
I heard that just from somebody just the other day, that it was a bit of hyperbole going on, I think. But the words used were the jockeys are in a near permanent state of rage. So, clearly as journalists we have to try and tap into that and get onto the front pages.
Indeed, we absolutely do. I mean, what is infuriating the jockeys? We've got the testing issue here, but what else is on there?
There's probably a whole suite of things, but I mean, the testing one is the one that they're focused on right at the moment. The idea that you can get a false positive and lose your livelihood for what may be a crucial week in your life. And Sean's not been compensated, if I've understood correctly. Nobody's offering to sort of pay him back on the money he lost. That's a really serious thing. I think they are going to have to change that, aren't they? I mean, could we foresee a situation where you don't get suspended until the B sample confirms the positive test? Would that be one way forward? Either that, or they're going to have to improve the test so that it doesn't come up with these false positives.
Well,
we've had 2 in a year,
Yeah, they're quick, and a point that he raised quite well, I thought, was, he requested, could I perhaps just take another one just to double check, and that very possibly would have thrown up a negative, wouldn't it, because it was a false positive on the first. There doesn't seem to be much wiggle room, which again, playing devil's advocate, the other side is, there shouldn't be. It has to be necessarily very robust, because we're talking about the integrity of the sport and safety, and it's worth noting that the PJA welcomed the introduction of these tests.
Yeah. I don't think you could have a situation where someone who fails a drug test is allowed to continue
another go?
riding.
No.
Yeah, or even have another go. It's
difficult.
very, very difficult. And at the same time, how can you not be sympathetic to Sean Levey losing the chance of a £20,000 top rider award in the racing league? I mean, that's a deposit on a house. It's a significant sum of money. And Sean Levey's obviously been a very successful jockey. I'm sure, nonetheless, £20,000 is a lot of money to him. But there's some jockeys for whom that would be, completely life-changing. So if you've lost the chance to win that on the basis of a false positive, then you're completely entitled to be upset about it. I just don't quite know what the solution is, other than if you're going to have a test, it needs to be a test where false positives are not just rare, but vanishingly rare.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like the mischief that's being aimed at, is not so, scary as to trump the basic right of anybody to earn their living. I mean, it's not as though we had fear beforehand that, jockeys were going out there sort of coked up to the eyeballs and a danger to everybody. That kind of behaviour is really outlier stuff, So if we just sort of leave them to get on with it and don't have saliva tests, then I would still be fairly confident that it was as safe as before. So they need to get it right. Otherwise, I just don't think it's justified to meddle in people's ability to earn a living.
And I sense that's the complaint, is that it's very black and white. And okay, if you get a false positive, that's frustrating, it happens, you're stood down, like you say, necessarily stood down, you can't be allowed to ride if there's even a 0.1% of a chance that you have something in your system. But it's then the aftermath of that, there needs to be something in place the next day that can turn a test around fast enough that you maybe lose 1 day or 2. It's not handing out this ban and then having to request a urine test and then waiting for 7 days for that to come back. It all feels a little bit slow, and whether that's a scientific, maybe there's a reason for that we've not quite grasped, and I'm sure there's a good reason, but
there should be a better system.
Yeah, it has to be quick,
exactly.
has to be clear, and what we don't want to see is jockeys being banned for a lengthy period of time when they're protesting their innocence, and there is a kind of, because reputationally it does have an impact, regardless of, because the original news story is banned because of a presumed a failed test. It doesn't
You're
read
right.
well.
And I mean, even though he's managed to sort of, he's back in the game and,
Yeah.
you know, he satisfied all of us, he never did anything wrong. There will be people out there who notice the first story, but not the second. And his reputation, you know, is still being affected in those people's minds. So, I mean, either they change the system, or else we've got to talk about compensation for when it's established that actually somebody shouldn't have failed it in the first place.
Let's turn to the Racing League, guys. There were two good pieces in the paper last week on Thursday. First of all, we had Andrew Dietz, who did a deep dive into the Racing League. He attended some of the fixtures, took the feeling on the ground, and wrote a piece which basically sort of concluded it's not quite a success yet, but it's improved enough on its first iteration that it's earned the right to go again. In the same edition, Richard Forrestal gave it what can only be called a back alley cudgelling, as he absolutely took it to pieces as a
Famously
ridiculous
like to sit
gimmick.
on the fence.
Indeed. Which camp are you in, John?
I mean, I'm slightly, not to disappoint, I slightly lean more towards Andrew Dietz's verdict. My default position on most things as a quote-unquote young person in racing is I like innovation, I like something new. I'm all for, having reported so much on the absence of change and going around in these cycles, I like the idea of someone doing something completely different. That being said, the fact it's new, the fact it's different, does not make it immune from criticism, and there is a hell of a long way for this to go before it certainly hits its objectives of getting new people in, because it isn't. And I found it a bit of a circus act myself, with people drumming up these kind of fake rivalries, and I understand the impulse to do that because you want to make it exciting. It's all right, it's on TV, let's get it, try and push it. It's not for lack of enthusiasm,
the
but
people who complain about that, have they ever watched wrestling? You know, they aware that goes on, and of course it's all fake, but everyone loves it anyway. You know.
Yeah, and you know, some people hate it, but you know, the sort of the trash talk, if you like, between Matt Chapman and Osborne and Kevin Blake, you know, it's clearly not to everyone's taste, but at least it made for a few entertaining segments, I suppose, and it was less cringeworthy when they were doing it on behalf of Team TalkSport and Team Billion Volt. Anyway,
there's been a baby step, hasn't there? There's been a step in that. It's whether, look, it's not, our cards on the table, it's not for me. It wasn't when they announced a team-based thing. But whether that means it needs to be consigned to the scrap heap just yet, I'm not sure, because it does have some positives. Whether, you know, is there an argument for running it in the winter when we need a slightly bigger highlight on the all-weather? Is there an argument for, I think Nick Luck put it forward, putting it in a very small time frame? You know, maybe if you ran it over 2 weeks rather than, it'll be easier to follow the various ups and downs of the league.
yeah.
I sort of feel it's a summer confection, isn't it? You know, I mean, it's the sort of, you could say, silly season stuff. Guys like us who are sort of proper racing fanatics are never really going to be on board with stuff like this. It's always going to be vulnerable to that kind of gimmick tag, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I still think there's something there. And you do have to keep trying these things to sort of broaden the appeal of your sport, try and bring in some people who might not otherwise have paid attention. So yeah, I mean, it can work as a light-hearted event, you know, through the summer. I don't think it should be trickling on it still at this time of the season. You know, it's a bit late for that. You want to stop it when the schools go back, probably.
It is tricky for them to find a good window for it, of course, because you know you have clashes with some pretty big meetings during that period. I thought one of the biggest problems, and it's one that's really actually quite easy to solve, is the fact that as sort of Richard Forrestal pointed out, you had Matt Chapman, you know, sort of ranting and raving with a backdrop of sort of, you know, a couple of geezers wandering across to get a pint. Now, okay, all-weather meetings, not the easiest sale in the world, but come on, there's a really easy answer to this. A few years back, we used to do free racing weeks. I went to one at Kempton, one of those, you know, typically deserted Wednesday night meetings, and there were 6,000 people in there. There was a brilliant atmosphere. Everyone had a great time, and I've never enjoyed an all-weather meeting more, even though I can't remember anything about the racing, but just because people were cheering and being happy. You know, surely, Racing League next year, give free entry, get 6,000 to 8,000 people in there, put some music on, make it, get the local universities involved, and just get an atmosphere, because that atmosphere would instantaneously elevate the sort of mood around it. Is that not a no-brainer?
I don't know about no-brainer, because there's always that worry, isn't there? If you give it away for free, then you're going to have trouble getting people to pay for it afterwards. But it does sound like quite a good way forward. Also, what's in my mind is I'm sure I read the PR guy behind this endeavour saying, all right, next year is year 3, we've got to start turning a profit. And maybe you don't do that by giving away all your tickets for free.
Well, just on that, I'm pretty confident that they've basically broken even this year. And the way they do that simply is because they have good field sizes, which generate good media rights returns. The attendances don't really matter. Whether you have 1,000 people in Newcastle paying £15 a pop, or 8,000 not paying nothing but putting stuff behind the bar, you're probably about breaking even. What's actually making them the money, though, is the media rights, and maybe that's another whole story in itself.
Well, in that case, packing a bunch of people into the racecourse would seem like a win, wouldn't it? Because people makes you relevant, and there's no bad thing if you've shown a bunch of people the way to find their local racecourse.
So, Racing League Year 3. What would we like to see? Any changes that could?
Tell you what annoyed me to an unreasonable degree is they've obviously decided to regionalise it, and I quite like that. I was nearly on board with cheering for Scotland. A lot more than the teams from last year, but so it seemed to be linked to where the trainers were around the country, and the jockeys could come from anywhere, and you had Scottish jockeys riding for Team London and Tom Marquand riding for Ireland. Can we not find enough jockeys in Ireland or from Ireland to represent Ireland? I think, given that the jockeys are really the most visible, the best known representatives of the sport, people know what kind of accent they speak with. They know where they're from in the country. Those guys should also be part of the geographical aspect of this. If you're going to really try and get people to believe and cheer for their team, the jockeys should also come from that region, I think.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, so that's our 3 stories. Going to do something slightly different now. Before we wrap up, we're just going to very quickly mention a story which is literally breaking as we film, which is that the great stayer Stradivarius has been retired with immediate effect. Got a bruised foot, was out for the season. So owner Bjorn Nielsen has just taken the view. Well, there's no point in delaying the decision any further. So Stradivarius has been retired. Chris, put him in context. Where does he sit in the stand in the pantheon of great stayers?
I tell you, I'm a bit nervous about doing that without his form in front of me and all the ratings figures, because John Randall will be on to tell me I'm an idiot, and I've forgotten about all these other stayers who are better than him. He's added hugely, hasn't he, to the entertainment of recent flat seasons. He's gone on, longer than almost any flat horse really, even stayers. He's by the standards of stayers, he's had a long career. Danced every dance, and he really is that horse that owes no one anything. Won a stack of good races. The last couple of seasons there's been more sort of excuses creeping in, the odd thing has gone wrong, maybe the ride wasn't perfect, maybe he ran into a bit of traffic here and there. But from a journalist perspective, that's all gravy, because he was one of those horses people really cared about what happened to him in a race, and those are the kind of horses that you need. People can latch onto and identify and get upset if they get beat, because that all adds to the story.
It's a shame he didn't have a more successful final season. Could have had some great moments, but it didn't quite work out, John.
Yeah, and I think we do crave those fairy tale endings, don't we? And Trushan and Kyprios have come onto the scene, and it's he's perhaps not quite the force he was, but there was enough to suggest before his injury that he was agonisingly close to still being the best stayer. He's not a million miles off those 2 rivals, but I think for me, look, he's kind of run concurrently with my career here, which is quite. I'm kind of he was one of the big horses when I joined the Racing Post, and he's still here 4 and a bit years later, or not anymore. But to kind of, he was an obvious sell for the sport, and I think part of his story, like you say, wouldn't it have been nice if he went unbeaten and then bowed out that way? Yes, it would, but also much of his appeal. And Great British Racing did a good job of selling him, I think, as they did with Enable. much of his appeal was the characters involved with him, and it was the Nielsen's interviews saying, I'm not quite sure about the ride, and it was Dettori kind of celebrating too early, and it was Gosden's, you know, eloquence when he's discussing the horse. You know, there's so much to it, but in his own right, just a fabulous, fabulous racehorse.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, and thank you as well, Chris. So we come to the conclusion. What's the week's biggest story? It's simply got to be the how to save British racing, the 48-hour emergency summit. You know, we're a broken record on this point. British racing has some massive structural issues. It has some very serious questions to answer around leadership and capacity for change. This was I guess, a step in the right direction, a tiny step, but one of a very long journey ahead. So it's on the front page, and it will stay there, and let's hope we get the outcomes the sport deserves. Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us, as well as thank you to my guests, Chris Cook and John Harding. Just before we go, let me finally say that if you would like more great Racing Post journalism, there is currently a 50% off deal for 3 months subscription to Members Club Ultimate, which gets you access to the digital newspaper, to all of our great journalism, to race replays, race analysis, and much more beside. Check in the description for more information on that. And just leaves me finally to say thank you so much for joining us, and please tune in again next week for more discussion of racing's biggest stories.